In today's video, we're going to be talking about routing buses and sends in Cakewalk by Bandlab. Now, if you're a beginner, this is going to be great for you, but even if you're experienced, you may pick up something that you don't already know. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. So understanding how audio is routed around your console in Cakewalk can not only affect your workflow, but can actually affect the sound of the final product itself. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the very basics of routing in Cakewalk. Then we're going to be looking at some more intermediate and advanced routing in Cakewalk. And also we're going to be taking a look at some Cakewalk specific features, which even if you've been using it for a while, you may not be aware of. But before we get stuck into that, if you do like this kind of content, all about home recording, DAWs, gear reviews, plugin reviews, that kind of thing, then please do subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you are notified about those future videos. Now let's get stuck into some routing. So here we are in a near empty project in Cakewalk. The only thing I've added is one short electric guitar part, and you can see that right on the left hand side of the console view here. And if I play it for you quickly, it goes like this. Told you it was short. Good for demonstration purposes, maybe not for my next hit single. So we've got that one track there, and then by default, Cakewalk creates 3 buses off the bat, and you can see them over towards the right here. Now, tracks and buses are separated by this divider here, which is draggable. So I'm going to drag it over so that we can put them all together, and then we can zoom in and take a closer look. Now, of these 3 buses which Cakewalk has created by default, I'm only actually going to be using one of them. So I'm going to get rid of the other 2, but let's take a quick look at what they are. So the first bus we have is the master bus. You can see its label at the bottom there, and that's the one we're going to keep. All tracks by default, when you create them, will be routed through to the master bus. A little bit more in detail on that routing a little bit later. Then we have the metronome bus here. We won't be using the metronome at all today, but if you have a project open, you still need the metronome, don't delete this, but I don't need it, so I'll right click and delete that bus. Then we have the preview bus. What this is in Cakewalk, there's a browser section where you can listen to sort of loops and things, and you can preview them by clicking on preview buttons there, and the sound then comes through to this channel here. We don't need that. In fact, I hardly ever use it, so I'll right click and delete it. So we're left with our main 2 channels here, but there are a couple of other hidden sort of channels with faders that you may not know about. So I'll zoom back out here again, and if we look all the way over to the right hand side of the interface, there's actually another divider here which is always squashed up to the right hand side. And if I drag that out, you can see that there's some more faders here. Now you may have less than this, you may have more than this. It depends on the audio interface you're using. And that's what these faders represent. Each pair of them represents outputs on your audio interface. Now, on my audio interface, I actually have lots and lots of outputs which are not enabled in Cakewalk, but what I do have enabled here is my master output, which is where my speakers, the output for my speakers goes. And then I have a couple of headphone outputs here, and I can control the overall volume of those, and I can route things to them so that I can create separate mixes for different headphone outputs. Now, that's not something we're going to be going through at all today, but I did just want to let you know it's there. Now, it may be that your audio interface only actually has 1 or 2 outputs, in which case you don't need to worry about this too much at all. So I'll drag that all the way back across to hide it, as we won't be using it. And let's zoom back in again and take a closer look at these 2 channels which we have here. So the first one, as I say, is the guitar track. And you always want to think of signals as starting at the top of these channels and working their way down through to the bottom. So with this guitar channel, we start at the top here, and the signal from the guitar hits this gain control here. Now, this is not something you have on all DAWs, but with Cakewalk, it's built into the channel here. I reckon it's really, really handy. This means you can set up a nice, healthy signal right at the beginning of your signal chain. If you want to know what a healthy signal is, take a look at my gain staging tutorials. I've done 2 or 3 of them already on the channel. After it's gone through the gain control there, it then makes its way through to the Pro channel. Now, the Pro channel is kind of similar to the Effects channel, which is just down here, just after it. But of course, it's specific to Cakewalk and it's always going to be there. If we expand it a little bit here, you'll see that I've already got a couple of modules in there, a compressor and an EQ. So what happens is the signal, when it comes into the Pro channel, starts off with this compressor at the top of the signal here. And after it's finished compressing the guitar, it then takes that compressed signal and sends it to this EQ. That's important. It takes the compressed signal and send it to the EQ. It's working through things in sequence, starting from the top, working its way through to the bottom. Now, as I say, the Pro channel behaves in a very similar way to the effects section here. So I won't be going through this in much detail, if at all, today. I won't be touching on it anymore. In any case, both of those modules are actually switched off at the moment, so they're not affecting my signal at all. So I'll collapse that back in there. So after we've dealt with the Pro channel, the signal then works through to the effects section here. And this is where we insert effects. That could be compressors, EQs, reverbs, delays. You know, there's so many of them. There's a few which come with Cakewalk. There's some that you can buy. And there's a few free ones available as well, which I've often talked about. The important thing to understand here is it does work through each effect in sequence, just as it did in the Pro channel. Now, I'm going to be talking about some important considerations with that in the next little section, but we'll get back to that because it is quite important. Even if you've used it many times before already, there may be some things you haven't considered in terms of sequence. So after it's finished with the effects module, then it goes through to the sends section. Now, the sends section may appear to be similar to the effects section, but it actually behaves very, very differently. And there's some specific reasons why you would use this and not the effects section. And you may have wondered about this if you're just starting out with a home recording or recording. And don't worry, I'm going to make that clear about why you would make those decisions a little bit later. After it's finished with the send section, it then works its way down through to the pan and then through to the master fader, which of course controls the overall sort of output from that channel. Now, where does it go from the channel is the important thing. By default, as I mentioned, it goes through to the master section here. And you can see that if you go down to this bottom drop down here, where you can select different outputs, it is set to master already. We'll be talking about that a little bit later because that is quite important, because you may sometimes want to send it off to different places. So as I say, it starts at the top, it works its way down through, and then I sort of think of it as going across and then back up to the top of this bus which it gets sent to, which is the master bus, and then it does the same thing again. It works its way down through from the top all the way down to the bottom in the same way before it hits its output from the master bus there, which in this case is that master output on my audio interface, which I talked about earlier. So with all of that said about the basic routing, let's take a look at what actually happens in the effects section. Now, as I say, it's important to remember with the effects section that we start at the top of it and we work through each plugin or effect in sequence. And you'll often hear people talking about the order of effects chains and what is a good order, especially, for example, with compression and EQ. Should it be EQ first or then compression? The answer is it depends, but we'll talk about that in another video. But oftentimes it's sort of difficult to hear the effect which is happening, especially if you're just starting out. You may not hear the difference between having effects in a different order. So I've kind of tried to set up an example here, which is a really sort of obvious, really obvious when you actually hear it. So we've got our guitar track, which, as you remember, just plays one chord, and I've got a couple of effects on here. So the first one is a delay effect. So if we've got it switched off at the moment, we'll just play the guitar track to remind you. Just that, right? Okay. And if we switch the delay on, what we've got is several sort of repeats with almost a second between them. Let's have a listen. And of course, they get quieter and quieter as it goes on. That's important, but we'll get back to that. We'll switch that off and we'll have a look at the next effect which we've got in there, which is this TH3 effect, which comes for free with Cakewalk, a whole bunch of guitar effects in there, amp simulations, etc. And all I've got here is just an overdrive pedal, which is going to overdrive the guitar. So let's have a listen to that. So the important thing about overdrive, of course, and this is important, is it needs a certain amount of signal, a certain level of signal to actually start to overdrive. If the signal is quiet, then the guitar will remain relatively clean. Now that's important because remember, the delay gets quieter and quieter as it goes. You may be ahead of me here, but I'll continue anyway. So what's the combined effect of these two things? We'll switch on the delay. So the delay is the first thing that the guitar hits, and then it goes through to that overdrive. Let's have a listen and see if you can hear what's happening. Now, if you're not sure what I'm alluding to, then just rewind the video and have another listen. What actually happens is we start off with a very overdriven guitar, and as each repeat goes by and the signal gets quieter, it not only gets quieter, but it gets less overdriven. Another quick listen. Okay, and that's because the delay plugin is continually generating more signal after a delay, and each signal has less level. And it's hitting that guitar plugin, that TH3 overdrive plugin, with less signal. So it's affecting it in a different way each time it hits it. So what if you actually wanted that overdriven sound to be repeated again and again? Easy, you would just swap the two around. So what's going to happen here is the main signal is going to hit at its sort of top level that overdrive plugin. Could work either way. And then that overdriven signal then hits the delay, and the delay repeats the overdriven signal again and again. So it sounds like this. So always when you're thinking about the sequence of your plugins, you want to be thinking about the way that signal hits the next plugin and whether it's going to be affecting it in the way that you want it to. It's a very overt example. You don't often get examples as overt as that. Oftentimes, as I say, people are considering it in terms of, you know, should I have the EQ first and then the compressor, or both, or what have you. We'll get onto that, as I say, in another video. So that's the effects section and the sequence of things there. We're going to be moving on to sends, which acts in quite a different way. Now, as I mentioned, sends behave quite differently to effects inserts, and we're going to be taking a look at that now. So I've got my guitar chord here again. And I'm going to start off by creating a send through to that overdriven signal. So I'm going to click on the plus button here to create a new send, and I'm going to create a new stereo bus. So you can either create something new or you can send it to an existing bus. So in this case, it's something new. We're going to name this one overdrive. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to add an effect in there, an audio effect, and I'm going to choose the one we did earlier, TH3. We'll insert that in there, and then I'll just, once it's loaded up, select the preset, which is routing, which is what I used earlier, and then we'll close that. Now let's see what's happening here. What actually happens is the signal makes its way down the chain, and it branches off here over to the bus here, which is the overdrive bus which we've created. What do I mean by branching off? Well, it goes off to that bus, but it also continues on down through the rest of the channel, all the way down through to the output. So you end up with two simultaneous signals happening. We'll just have a quick listen to it. Okay, now if I mute this bus and I play it again, you can still hear that guitar coming through its actual channel there. So the dry signal of the guitar continues on down through to the bottom and goes, of course, through to the master bus as it did earlier. But it also branches off, it splits in two and goes to this bus over here, which of course has the overdrive effect on it. So let's add another bus in there. We'll create another send here. We'll do a new stereo bus. See, another one appears. We're going to call this one, we'll call it delay. Okay. So you may have guessed what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go to the effects section. I'm going to insert an audio effect, and then I'm going to go to Cakewalk, goes to Sonatus, delays, brings up my trusty old delay, and I'll choose this preset which I've set up for routing. Okay, let's have a quick listen to that. Oh, beg your pardon. We'll listen again. I'll unmute the TH3 plugin. Let's have a listen to that. Take two. Okay, so what you heard was one very overdriven signal and then a whole bunch of delays which had no overdrive on them whatsoever. And that is because the dry signal branched off from the overdrive here, went up to the overdrive bus where it's overdriven. But that dry signal then continued to the delay down here and was branched off to the delay. So with the effects sends here, or sorry, I should say the bus sends here in your channel, they're not working in sequence. They're branching off, but they're all receiving the original signal which existed before that. So that's a big consideration when we're talking about buses and important to understand. So just to recap, it branches off to the overdrive, but continues down through the chain. It branches off again to the delay, but it continues down through the panning and fader and goes through to its output, which is the master bus there. Now, that's a very odd sort of example of use. So in the next section, we're going to talk about some more typical examples of why you might use buses. Okay, so I have a very simple track set up here. In fact, it's a work in progress, a song that I'm working on at the moment, and it's got a couple of guitars in it, a Martin guitar and a Taylor guitar. Now, they're not real guitars, they're actually virtual guitars. They're Ample Sound guitars. I'll show you what I'm using. First of all, I'm using this Martin guitar from Ample Sound here, and then I'm also using this Taylor. So if we listen to the Martin first, I'll just mute the Taylor. It sounds like this. And then if we mix it with the Taylor, they sound like this together. Okay, cool. So what if I think I want to add some reverb to the Martin guitar? I've already sort of jumped the gun here and done it. I may think, oh, I'll just chuck a reverb here in the effects section as an insert. And that's what lots of beginners will do without thinking about it too much, and they'll get their reverb. Great. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm adding a lot there, aren't I? That's actually cavernous, makes it sound like it's in a massive cathedral or something. Probably not what I would do in the actual song, but good for demonstration purposes. Okay, so then we've got the Taylor guitar and we think, oh, we want the same kind of effect because they exist in the same space here. So we would do the same thing and we would insert that effect here for the Taylor guitar. Now, what I'm actually going to do is drag this one across while I hold control on my keyboard. It just makes a copy of it there. Didn't know that one, did you? Now, we've got two of the same reverb happening, and they're both big, and they're on these guitars, and they sound like this. Now, the problem I have is if I think, well, that's just too big, and imagine I've done this for several instruments because I've put several through, and I think, well, that reverb's just too big, then I've got to go through to each of these plugins and change the settings on each of the plugins, and it's going to be very, very tedious, not very convenient, and it also uses up unnecessary resources on the computer. So this is the first reason why you may use sends, because you can share plugins between different instruments or tracks. So I'm going to take that Sonatus reverb and I'm just going to drag it all the way across to this bus I've created over here, which is called reverb, and I'll just delete it from this Martin guitar here. So instead of having them on the effects section, I'm going to use send. So for the Martin, I'll add a send and I'll send it through to my reverb bus, which I'd already created, and I'll do the same for the Taylor. Cool. Now, if I play that, and I think, you know what? There's way too much reverb there. I can actually just use this fader here to tone it down. Blend it in. So that's really great. And the other thing, of course, I've still got is some individual control, because I can control the level that I send through. So if I want lots of reverb, for example, to be on the extra guitar, the Taylor, but not so much on the initial one, the Martin, then I can just drag it down here and have a listen to that. Okay, so that's one use or one good reason to use a bus for effects. Now, the other good reason is that you can chain effects together in a single bus. And reverb is a really good example of this. I'm just going to switch it off from the Taylor there. I'll just turn it off and I'll actually mute the Taylor guitar. So we're just listening to the Martin guitar. Let's have a listen again. Now, reverb is classic for making things muddy down the bottom end, because it's, of course, it's affecting that whole signal. So what I would do in this case is, in fact, insert some sort of EQ before the reverb. So I'm going to insert, let's have a look. We'll use Fab Filter, Pro Q3, as I usually do. And what I'm going to do here is just get rid of all the bottom end of this signal here using, we'll use the cut there, and we'll just drag it all the way up there. So what's happening now is we're going through from the actual guitar. I'll just try and reduce this for a second, if I can remember how to do it. Okay, there we go. So we're going through from the guitar, and it's hitting this, in fact, I'll change the order here. It's hitting the EQ first, where we're getting rid of all the bottom end, the bass end, and then we're only sending through the top end to the EQ. This is a good example of cleaning the reverb up. Let's have a listen. Now I'll turn that EQ off. You can hear all that bottom end muddiness there. So that's just one example of when we may chain effects together. How would we have done that if we hadn't used a send, if we'd tried to do this in the effects section over here? Well, let's have a look. We'll drag that over there, and we'll drag that reverb back over there. So the whole thing is happening now in this effects or insert section. Nothing's being sent over to the bus. Let's have a listen. That EQ has affected the whole sound of our guitar and thinned it out. We're not just, adding it in just before the reverb. We're actually affecting the whole signal. So it's only possible really to do this if we actually use a bus. So that's one of the very, very good reasons to use a bus. Now, a very, very important consideration when you're using sends in Cakewalk, or indeed any other DAW, is a button which is often ignored, and you'll see here it's called the post button, and it's switched on at the moment to post fader, and it can be switched off. Now, this has an important effect on our routing at times, so let's quickly look through what it means. In a basic sense, what it means is the signal being sent through to the bus being affected by the fader or not? If we are set to have that off, then the signal is not affected by the fader, and if it's switched on, then the signal going through to the bus is affected by the fader. So why does this matter to us at all? Well, I'm going to use one example of why it matters, and that should hopefully explain the way you need to think about these things. I have a very simple example here of some parallel compression, and I've put it on some vocals in the same song we were working on a moment ago. So what is parallel compression? Don't worry too much about that. I'm going to give you a very 30-second crash course. What happens with parallel compression is we send this vocal in this example through to this bus here where we have a compressor. It doesn't matter which compressor. I'm using this one in this case, is T-Rex one, but it could be any compressor. And what happens with parallel compression is we generally really compress it very hard, very heavily, to a point where by itself it does sound pretty terrible. If I just actually mute or just solo the compressor, in fact, and I'll play this vocal here with the fader up.
Of all the things we could get right, we taught each other how to fight.
You can hear that that's a very compressed signal indeed. And that doesn't matter for parallel compression, because what we actually do is we use the original signal of the vocal and then we blend in that highly compressed version, and that helps us to keep whatever it is we're compressing present. So I'll put it down here. Someone will have a listen to that vocal now.
Of all the things we could get right, we taught each other how to fight.
And that's very ballpark kind of okay. Now, of course, we have two things going on here. The original vocal, which continues down through the chain as we discussed before, and then we have this bus. Now, if we use this fader at all, which we probably will do on a vocal to keep it, to sort of adjust the mix with automation as we go along, because we're using that fader, we're going to affect the amount of signal which is sent through to that compressor. If I play it and then bring it down, you'll see that the signal disappears as I bring it down over here. So not only have I lowered the vocal there down to nothing, I've actually affected the amount of signal which is going through to the compressor. That means that it's being compressed less and less, because compressors need a certain level of signal before they kick in, before they hit their threshold. And we may not want that to happen. We may want it to continue to compress that signal, even though we're lowering the main signal. So in that case, we would switch this button over so that the signal now, it's got the post off, which means that the signal is going through at this level we've set here through to the compressor, regardless of what's happening with the fader. So if we play it again, I'm going to drag this fader down, but you will see over here that there's still signal going through to the compressor.
Of all the things we could get right, we taught each other how to fight.
So that's really the importance of that particular function there, and it's an important consideration. You can really come unstuck sometimes, especially when you're using automation. Now, just going to go on to a slightly new problem here, but it's worth talking about here in terms of routing. The problem we've got with this particular example is these two things are in balance with each other. We've got a kind of a mix between the two of the vocal at a certain level and then the compression. And although when we reduce that vocal, we still want to compress it at the same sort of rate, if you like, we may actually want to lower its initial or its original its eventual output. We want to keep them in balance with each other. I'm going to quickly show you how I would do that. I would create a new bus over here. We will call this, what we're going to call this bus, we'll just call it Vox, just for giggles. Now, from the output of Susie's vocals here, we're going to set that to Vox. So it goes all the way through to this new channel. And then we're going to take that compressed channel there and we're going to set its output to Vox. So they're both going through eventually to this bus. That means we can then use this new bus to affect the whole level of the vocal and keeping that mix, that balance between the vocal and the compressed vocal the same. So now we can do that.
Of all the things we could get right, we taught each other how to fight and turn a heart into a stone.
So I hope that's clear. You may need to rewind that a little bit and watch it again if I didn't explain it that clearly. But it's a really important thing, and it's another reason why we may create buses, to group things together. And just on that final note, that's what I'm going to talk about next. So another reason to create buses is to create kind of little sub-mixes of items within your mix. What can happen is as you add more and more instruments, things can get kind of out of control and difficult to mix. So it's good to create little sub-mixes. So let's look at some examples here. I'm going to look at this one here. It's called, the first track here is called Mike, that's me, and the other one's called Mike Harmony. These are two different takes on different tracks, but they actually sonically want to kind of sound the same. And now that I've got a balance between them, you can see the second one is slightly down on the fader there. I just want to treat them as one voice, if you like. So what I'm going to do is create a new bus over here, a stereo bus. I'm going to name it Mike Vox. And then I'm going to set its output at the bottom of the track for the first one to Mike Vox. And I'm going to set the second one to Mike Vox. And I'm going to change the color of it over here, just at the bottom on the right hand side. You can still see it a bit. Let's change it to, oh, what do I fancy for me? Green. Green for go. It's a positive. And you can see that whenever you send outputs to a bus, if you recolor that bus, it also recolors those tracks as well, which is kind of handy because you can see what they're linked to. Let's move on. There's also another couple of tracks here from Susie and Susie Harmony, and I've also set up a balance for those. So again, I'm going to set a new stereo bus up. I'll just drag all this over so you can see it a bit more clearly. And I'm going to call that one Susie. Susie Vox. And you've guessed it, I'm going to send the output of that, of Susie's first vocal and her second vocal, which is a harmony vocal, through to Susie Vox. And I'll recolor that. And I'll make it, I was going to make it kind of pink, but that's a bit stereotypical, isn't it? So let's go blue instead. Now, I could continue on. I've got a couple of guitars there. I could group those together. And then I've got a bass guitar, which I probably wouldn't group. And then I've got a couple of pianos. And what's going to end up then is I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of sub-mixes over here. I'm probably going to end up with, say, 4 or 5 tracks rather than the 9 tracks I had originally. And then I can do my kind of major mixing over there. Lots less faders to deal with and lots of shared resources. That means that when you start EQing things, or when you start adding reverb to things and all those things, you can sort of treat them as a group. Of course, if you need to treat them separately, it's not a good idea to send them their outputs through to the same bus if you want to have sort of different effects in their chain. So that's another really good reason to create buses. Now, another type of channel that we can route to in Cakewalk is an aux channel or auxiliary channel. And I'm going to demonstrate this using the bass guitar in my little song. I've got this bass guitar here, which is another Ample Sound plugin. I'll just pull it up there. This is the Ample Bass P, Precision Bass Guitar plugin. It sounds like this. And that's the dry sound. I haven't got any amp on there at all. And in fact, that's what I want to do. I want to send this through to an amp sim. So the way I'm going to do it differently this time is I'm going to go down to Sends. And rather than select new stereo bus, I'm going to select a new aux track, and I'll click that. And you'll notice that unlike a bus which appears all over on the right hand side, if I drag that over, it will normally appear next to the master bus there. Instead, this has appeared right next to our bass guitar there as a new track, and we'll get onto the importance of that in a moment. So what I'm going to do is add an effect in there. I'll insert an audio effect. And I'll go down to Overloud TH3 here, and we'll insert this effect which we used earlier. And I've got a preset set up. That's the routing one there. And this is a bass amplifier set up there. So I've now got it going through to this track, which is handily right over here next to the bass guitar. And it's as if I'd recorded it in the studio and I'd put a mic on the amplifier or on the speaker cabinet itself. And I can now blend those two signals together. So I think that's a really interesting, it's a way I like to do that. It's something I often do with bass guitar signals as well, whether they're virtual basses or real bass guitars. And you'll notice one important thing about this, which is quite different to a bus, and that is that you do have the ability to record these channels. So I could record enable this and hit the record button up there, and the signal coming through to it would be recorded to that channel permanently. So that's quite an interesting feature that you may want to use, but in this case I'm just going to use it in a similar way to a bus, but handily it's over there next to the bass guitar. And now I'm going to look at the last type of routing which we do in Cakewalk, which is using patch points. So the last example of routing which I'm going to talk about is patch points. Now patch points are a strange thing for me because I know how they work and I know how they're different to auxiliaries and buses, but I haven't quite figured out how I would use them yet. So I'm going to leave it for you to tell me down in the comments how you would use patch points. But first of all, I'm going to explain how they actually work and what makes them different. So let's start off with this piano over here. I'll just give it a quick listen. It's sort of midway through the song. It sounds like this. Okay, so fairly straightforward. So what I'm going to do is an effects send here. I'm going to create a, rather than new stereo bus or a new auxiliary, I'm going to create a new patch point. So I'll click that and you'll see nothing's happened. No new channel has happened. Patch points are a kind of internal routing, or that's the way they're described by Cakewalk. And in order to get any sort of use out of them, we actually need to create a new audio track here. So I'll insert an audio track. And you'll see I've got a new audio track there. And I'm going to make the input for this audio track the patch point. So we can go over here. Here's the patch point we just created when we created the send, and we're going to go over and we're going to select the stereo signal from that patch point. So we'll do that there. And in fact, I'm just going to go back in there again because there's an option to rename it. So I'm just going to call it piano patch. Okay, there you go. So we've got that there. Now, if I play the piano, you will see it goes through to that as a regular send. Okay, so far it's very, very similar, if not identical, to an auxiliary, right? But a little bit more trouble, perhaps. Well, here's where things get a little bit interesting, because if I just drag this around, if we make another auxiliary, another audio track here, which I'll drag across. In fact, let's make another one, and even another one. There you go, we've got a few here. You may be ahead of me here. Let's make the input for each of these. In fact, just for giggles, let's do the left channel on that one, and then let's do the right channel on that one. And what you can see here, from just this one send, we're sending it off to 4 different channels. And it's getting louder. Now, of course, we could send other instruments through to any one of those channels if we wanted to. So if we created say a patch here on this, we'll send it to the piano patch, this guitar, we'll unmute it. Now the guitar is going to also go through to all of those 4 channels. Okay, so that's how it works. That's something you couldn't, or you could do it with auxiliaries or buses, but you'd just be doing it in a different way. So I've pondered over this. So I do a lot of pondering, you know, and that's how it works, but I've never really found a use for it in my project. So do let me know if you think there's a really good use case for this in the comments down below. And hey, you could help to improve my workflow. So I do hope this video has been useful to you. Now, it's quite possible that you may do things in a slightly different way, maybe even better. If so, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear about that. Also, you may be confused about this. Go ahead and ask in the comments. Myself or someone else will be glad to help you out. If you like this video, then you can help me out by hitting the like button. That lets YouTube know that you found it useful and it's going to show it to other people. If you didn't like this video, then hit the dislike button twice. And if you like this kind of content, then please do make sure you subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you are notified about my future videos. And I'll see you in the next video.